And I'll just start out by saying that I was in education, as I was just telling Liz, and I had a principal in Washington State who would fly to New York twice a year, spend a week in New York City, go to every off and on Broadway musical. And she came home, several years ago talking about this musical about Hamilton. And I thought, who wants to see a musical about one of the founding fathers? It sounded so boring to me that I wasn't the least bit interested. And so last month we rented Disney Plus to see the Beatles because I'm an old Beatle fan. And when I was done with the 8 hours, because Sandy didn't want to have any part of that. When I was done with the 8 hours, I thought, okay, that's right, Hamilton is here too. And so we watched it together, and I was absolutely transfixed. I was wondering, this is what I've been missing for all these years. Incredible, and I liked it much better than the Beatles. The writing is superb, the text is superb, the music is great, the vocal production, the choreography, and I was just completely taken in. So I've watched it 3 times now. I bought the soundtrack. I've been listening to it, and I just absolutely love the show. And so we had a little conversation about it 2 weeks ago, and then we had no expert on board, but Liz's name came up, and we thought, let's invite her to come back and talk about it some more. So please welcome Liz Moore, who is a theater director at ConVal High School, who loves this show. And why don't you give us some of your impressions of the show, and then just take it from there, Liz?
Sure. Hi, thank you for having me. I live in Peterborough. I teach at ConVal High School. And I've always loved musical theater. When I grew up in Missouri, we didn't have a lot of access to Broadway shows in the middle of the country, but every once in a while you would get a touring show come through St. Louis. And so I actually started going to touring Broadway productions with our French club. We went to Les Miserables and then Phantom of the Opera. And actually the first time we went to see Les Mis, I had a show that evening. And so there was a group of us who had to get in a car and go back to our high school to start the show before Les Mis ended. So somehow I convinced my parents to then buy me a ticket, and we went and saw it when it traveled through Peoria a few months later, because I'd never seen the ending of the show. So that sort of started my obsession with musicals. So I didn't have a teacher who would come back from New York and tell me about shows. I was on the internet researching shows and trying to find out about pieces of theater. And now living in New England, it seems like it would be easier to go to New York, except it's pandemic, so no one really wants to travel. And I had first heard about Hamilton in 2009. I had been a fan of Lin-Manuel Miranda's first musical, In the Heights, when it was on Broadway. And while it was still on Broadway, he had introduced the first number from this show at an evening of spoken word and poetry at the White House. And it was on YouTube. And I thought it was fantastic. And every couple of years, I would kind of check in on the internet, like, what's happening with that Hamilton thing? And nothing seemed to be happening with the Hamilton thing. Until all of a sudden, everything was happening with the Hamilton thing. Everybody was interested and everybody wanted to see it. And the thing that I love about Hamilton is some of the things that I love about Les Mis. The way that the story is told, all through music. There's really no dialogue except the dialogue in song. And if you talk to my kids, my students at school, they'll tell you that I really love circular stories. So stories where either the themes and the songs and the characters all come back in various ways, recursive ways. So in Les Mis, you'll have one character sing a song, and then we'll see it later in the show at a different tempo in a different key. And not only does it have a different meaning, but the two songs impact each other in their meaning. And Hamilton does that as well. People have compared the way that Hamilton is written to, Shakespeare. And I'm not a Shakespeare expert per se, but I think that if you look at text closely, it's you could take every little piece of really great pieces of art, and you could spend 8 hours breaking them down, and maybe you still love them at the end and maybe you don't. But I think that Hamilton is interesting in that in the time when the American musical became really popular, because America did sort of create the big Broadway musical, the songs from musicals were the songs that you would hear on the radio. You know, popular recording artists would record songs from shows, and we have not had that for a long time until Hamilton made songs from Broadway popular, because the song on Broadway was like songs that were popular. It sort of, you know, folds in on itself in a lot of interesting ways. So it brings me together with people who I, you know, might not have a lot musically in common with, but we can talk about storytelling and art in a way that I don't think has been accessible to a lot of people for a time. And particularly having the show available on Disney Plus, where everybody can see it, is really beneficial, because usually Broadway shows you don't get a movie of until somebody decides they want to, you know, put some sort of famous actor in the middle of it, and then it's a very different thing. And here you have the stage version captured in a way that's, I think, really remarkable.
Yeah.
So that was very long-winded. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I will not answer that long in the future, but that's why I love Hamilton and why I love musicals. And so here we are.
Well, I thought it was interesting what you said, because I have been looking at the music of the 50s and the 60s the past week, just for some own personal research that I'm doing. And I noticed, you know, a lot of musicals are represented in the top 40 radio of that time. And like you say, it hasn't been happening lately. And Hamilton certainly has bridged that gap in a way that no other show has in many, many years. And, you know, the whole idea of using hip hop, which I'm not really a huge fan of hip hop. I'm an old hippie. So, you know, but the poetry of the hip hop has just captivated me and made me want to listen to more hip hop as a result. So I don't know if you want to comment on that as well.
Something that I think people have pointed out about Hamilton, and in the Heights before it, people called it like a rap musical or a hip hop musical, as opposed to just being a musical that uses those forms. And I think Hamilton was really the first that was fully successful in using that musical style as a form of the storytelling, as opposed to kind of like a trite little, hey, here's our, they tried to do a Tupac musical and some other musicals using that kind of, using those styles of music. But instead of making the style of music the forefront in this show, the storytelling has to work, and the lyrics have to work, and the choreography has to work. And you can't just rest on the fact like, oh, it's cute that he rhymes some words together,
Yeah.
or that, and that has allowed other musicals to now use that as form, not as the content of the show. It's an acceptable form to use, just like before rock wasn't acceptable for a Broadway musical. You know, right. It was the trope, and then you make it accessible for other people.
Right. Well, I know it's not just hip hop, because it gets into rhythm and blues, a little bit of soul. And what I love is, we were talking about I'll Be Back a minute ago. I've made the comparison that the music in I'll Be Back, when you have King George singing, the music reminds me of late Beatles. I don't know if that's ever occurred to you. And it has a very British wave feel to it compared to all the other music in the whole show.
Actually, the gentleman who does all of the arranging of the show, Alex Lacamoire. So Lynn will kind of record something and he sings into a recorder, and then he will sing it back or send it to Alex, and Alex will then transpose it into music and decide what instruments should be played. He's actually mentioned specifically that they wrote Beatles references into the song. Okay. So I'm not a big Beatles person, so I'm just going to read a couple of the things that he said, because sure, you'll probably understand them. He says, there's a Penny Lane reference in the vibe in the first chorus. There's also a Mr. Kite reference. The synth has a bunch of Beatles references underneath it. The bass line is very Paul. he says the bass is muted, so it sounds like a Hofner. I don't know what that means, but I guess.
That's the
use
style of bass that Paul McCartney played.
All right. The drums are a fill I know I stole from Ringo. And the way Jonathan Groff intones everybody at the end is a little like Lennon and All You Need Is Love.
Yeah.
So there are lots of little things that they purposefully wrote into that piece that are like the Beatles. So very good catch.
Yeah. You'll have to send me that quote, those quotes. Yeah, that's great.
I have some of the articles that I've read over time. I sort of collected into like a PDF that I can you can share with whoever is interested in it. That
That'd be great. Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm going to, since there's a little pause here, if anybody has a question for Liz, we have a small enough group that you could physically raise your hand. If it gets any bigger, then we'll have to use the raise hand feature. Anybody have any questions or comments for Liz at this point as we're getting things going? Nancy, why don't you go ahead?
I just wonder, hi Liz. I just wonder if you can recite any of the pieces other than I'll be back, you'll be back, but you know, can you rattle off any of those parts?
Like on command right now? I'll say that my students and I will have, like, we'll be this last week we were painting the set for Frozen and we were listening to musical theater music as you do, and so a couple of my students and I rapped back and forth. I mean, rapped very loosely, like, let's not call it what it is not, but it's like a badge of honor if you can rap Guns and Chips, because it's the fastest words in the show. When the Marquita Lafayette, who could barely rap in English in the beginning of the show and doesn't know some words in English, and then at the he says the fastest lines in the show whenever they're about to go into the Battle of Yorktown.
Oh.
If you can do that at tempo with the recording, then you definitely won the Hamilton game again. So yeah, if I were listening along with it, I could probably repeat, like, I don't know, 90% of it.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be good. You don't want to pay to watch that. But I mean, a one-woman Hamilton happens in my car on a regular basis. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
David.
Was that an easy way to get around actually having to do that in front of people?
I'll tell you, Nancy, that her oldest son, who's now 7, when he was about 3 or 4, would sing along with "Not Gonna Throw Away My Shot." So he heard it enough times that he was singing along.
Well, and he was singing. So after Hamilton came out, they had the Hamilton mixtape, and then there were a bunch of other Hamilton inspired songs. So the Hamilton mixtape was like inspired songs from the show. Some of them were songs that there were very few songs that were cut from the show, but there were a few pieces that were cut that Lyndon had actual, like, the artist who had inspired him to write the pieces recorded them. So like you have Busta Rhymes singing Hercules Mulligan, who he wrote that to sound like. Or then there's some other artists who wrote songs inspired by ideas from Hamilton. And so technically Royce is rapping from that, like, mixtape version as opposed to the original version, but he doesn't remember that. I have a very cute video though.
Huh. So related to Nancy's question, what I like I said at the beginning, I love the writing. I mean, it's just, to me, it's just perfect. Do you have favorite lines that jump out at you from the show, that, since you're much more familiar with it than me? What are some of those?
There's in my shot, the line where it says, he says in parentheses, because his 4 friends they're all at the tavern and they're going back and forth trying to, like, see who can out verbal wordplay each other and show how, you know, it's Lynn compares it to like a playground rap battle, like who's got the best rhyme. And I can't remember what Hamilton says off the top, but all of his friends he says in parentheses, which is just like stage directions. So I get a kick out of that. pretty much all of the repetition in Farmer Refuted, which is the song right before You'll Be Back, where Samuel Seabury is reading his like declaration of why King George is so great and that we should all be in love with King George. And Hamilton is taking the ends of the lines or the middle of what he's saying and rhyming with it and undercutting his Seabury's argument the entire time is just so clever and quick. And there's some really, I don't know, just the sarcasm. I love a good sarcastic quip. And when it's folded into what's supposed to be like, you know, art, that gives me shivers.
Yeah.
This isn't a written line, but at the end of Say No to This, his song with Mariah Reynolds, it ends with, well, it's a written line. He says, nobody needs to know is the very last line that he sings, but that's actually a line from another musical called The Last 5 Years by Jason Robert Brown. And it's a line from a song in that show where the character is admitting to an affair. And after he sings it, he's borrowed, with the composer's permission, there's a cello movement that's just, I love it in The Last 5 Years, and then to hear it in Hamilton just made me a little weepy. It's pretty cool.
Is there a record of all the things that are borrowed that are brought into this show? Because sounds like there's a lot.
I would say that there's 2 places you could go to get a lot of information on where they've referenced other things. One of them is this book. We call it the Hamiltome, but Hamilton the Revolution. And it has like an article in front of each song. And then Lynn has basically annotated the show. So you can read the lyrics and then his notes about what inspired him to write it, or what he wrote first and then how he rewrote it. That's really interesting. And then once you get through that, if you go online to genius.com, it's annotated song lyrics from anything. And the annotated song lyrics for Hamilton are so dense and wonderful that
Wow.
to get into that, you could read its musical references, actual annotations from the creators, from contributors, like making connections through the show, or also like the historical fact checking is in there too. It's a kind of fun place. I could not get through all of the genius.com annotations before this meeting today because it's so good. It's very long.
So speaking of historical fact checking, what have you found that some glaring discrepancies between fact and what is put in the musical? Are there any big ones?
I mean, there are lots of big ones. I mean, but so for example, there are a lot of characters who you meet when you wouldn't have met them, or they've purposefully changed timelines, not because it changes the impact of what's happened, but because it's just cleaner storytelling.
Right.
Or it's, more meaningful. So, why do we meet all 4 of his friends at one time in the beginning of the show? Well, because you need a male quartet to sing with your rapping lead stars. How you can't wait half of the show to meet the other half of them. We don't care about them anymore. And then we can't double cast them in an interesting way, right?
Right.
And there's some historical record that is a little bit hazy, a little bit fuzzy. Like, did these people meet here? Did they meet here? Well, you know what? Like the intent of what is presented is intended to not be a moment for moment documentary about Alexander Hamilton. And
Right.
it certainly doesn't cover all of the things that Hamilton did well or poorly. It's like, here are the main themes of what we want to tell about them, and that's like the job of a dramaturg in any show, is figuring out which pieces are important and which pieces you have to let go of.
Right.
Otherwise you can't keep your story focused.
Right. What are your favorite performances in the show?
Wait for it. Is and you're probably asking like performers.
Yeah, as well. Yeah, both. Both the piece and the performer.
Yeah, so I could probably watch Hamilton and just watch every single thing that Leslie Odom Jr. does, because like his vocal performance, but also his acting performance is so specific. And Brian and I went and saw him perform a concert at the Burlington Jazz Festival a couple of years ago, and he's just a performer who, like, of course he won a Tony Award. Of course, like if he hadn't won the Tony Award for that role, it would have been terrible.
Yeah.
Here's a little known fact, delving off. If you watch Hamilton again, the character of Hamilton walks in straight lines and right angles. The character of Aaron Burr, the way that Leslie created him, walks in arcs. He never walks in a straight line anywhere.
Oh, wow.
Ever. So even when he's turning around, he like circles himself through. And sometimes it's hesitant. Like I was watching, I was like, oh, I don't know. I think he went straight there. And then he just like fish hooks it a little bit. And you're like, that is clever. It's so clever because it's physically embodying what what his character is thinking and what his character's problem is. So anyway, Leslie Odom Jr.
Yeah, that's great.
And Wait for It, I think, is probably the best song that Lynn could ever write.
Which one is that?
Wait for It.
Okay, yeah.
I also have a soft spot for Dear Theodosia, because you know, I have young kids, but also I love how it's really sad because the two children that they're singing to about, you know, making the world a better place and how they've made the world a better place for them both die young. So
Yeah.
Hamilton's son dies in a duel and is literally blown away. Theodosia, Burr's daughter, is lost at sea in a shipwreck. She's also blown away. So it's just as sad that, I don't know,
Yeah.
the mom feels on that
Yeah.
are pretty tricky. And I love Daveed Diggs as Lafayette and Jefferson, because he is a rapper who also acts, as opposed to some people are actors who also rap. And so
Yeah.
he came to the show with, here's the skill I have. He also, like you said, this sounds like a terrible idea. I don't want to have anything to do with that. That sounds awful. But if you'll pay me, I guess I'll show up and help you out. And he also won a Tony Award. So that worked out well for everybody.
Yeah. Does he have any background in French? I mean, he's very convincing at the beginning.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's done some theater before, but his big thing is in rapping, although now he's in a bunch of movies and TV shows and other things. You can watch his Disney Channel special song Puppy for Hanukkah is one I really like. It's for little kids, but it's cute. But I think all of the characters who are double cast have a really interesting challenge, and I love watching. It's that circular storytelling. I love seeing the same person playing somebody different means something different than just having two different people play different parts.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And the fact that you have Jefferson, who was in France, and him playing Lafayette, there's sort of a little interesting historical connection there as well.
Yeah. There's a line, you know, at least I know where France is. And it's hilarious because he's also Lafayette. Like some of those lines are funny because he's also Lafayette. He's like, where have you been? And he's like, France. Like all of that. It was me. You were talking to me. I was here the whole time.
Oh,
it's very memeable, I'll say.
yeah.
But then you have someone like Oak, who's playing this big brash Hercules Mulligan, who's only big and brash because his name is cool. He's a tailor, so I mean he's making pants. It's not very fancy, but then he becomes sickly, humbled, like quietly plotting James Madison. And so and he's a big guy, so to seem as if he's not overtaking everyone else is interesting.
Was he historically a big guy too? Or that's just the way he was cast?
He would, I don't think he was particularly, he apparently had a cough all the time.
Oh,
He was always sick. So Madison in the musical does cough in an awkward and obnoxious way.
Mhm.
So there's a nice historical factoid for you. I'm sure my dad would know much more about the real historical people than I do, just like the musicalized versions I know of them.
So David, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I looked up something about Mulligan this afternoon, and he was a tailor, and he was part of he and Hamilton with Washington were part of the spy ring that saved Washington's life at least twice from the British, and had a huge impact on getting information from the British that he was making clothes for and sneaking them to Washington to help with the whole thing. So yeah.
And he's very important, but Lin-Manuel Miranda admits that the reason why he put him in the musical is he's got a really cool name.
Yeah.
That name needs to be in a show. It sounds like a rapper. Hercules Mulligan?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great.
You asked earlier about things that were not historically accurate. The first duel in the show between General Lee and Colonel Lawrence, Hamilton was the second for Lawrence, but Burr was not the second for Lee. There was another guy. Burr was not part of that, but you got to throw it in there because they're the antagonist protagonist thing. But historically, that was not the duel was real, but not Burr's part in that.
Interesting.
So you already have people on stage that are more interesting than introducing some new other character, and it is more meaningful that they're already on opposite sides of things.
Yeah.
Speaking of them being on opposite sides of things, again, if you were to take another listen through the show, in the beginning of the show, Hamilton wants everything that Burr has. He wants to know how to get through college. He wants to know how to, join the revolution. When he's just like, how do I get to be who you are? And then Burr is like, how do I get to be Hamilton? Because Hamilton's getting all the things that I want now. And it's the moment when Burr decides to act more like Hamilton and just go for what he wants, and Hamilton decides to stop and think about it, that they come to this like tragic ending.
Mhm.
Grass isn't always greener and whatnot.
Yeah. Nancy.
Liz, do you have any comments or observations about the choreography and just the overall, everyone working together to on that stage, and it was that circular rotating stage.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
interesting how they did the choreography.
And I think it's actually two rotating tables, because the table in the middle, it's not just the thing on the outside that spins, the one on the middle also can counter spin. So technically you've got three different areas for them to all be working on, which is very challenging. Andy Blankenbuehler is the choreographer, and there's some videos, I think they're with the Wall Street Journal on YouTube, where he breaks down the work that he does in, I think it's My Shot. And it looks just like, okay, this is sort of, it's like a little bit of street dancing. There's some things that sort of evoke ballet or traditional musical theater for a second. And you're like, where's all this coming from? And when he breaks it down, each movement has a meaning. So, you know, in my shot, he's like, and this one's like the Pledge of Allegiance. And then this is us, you know, grabbing what we want. And then here is, you know, pointing the gun at the sky. Like there's like, you know, 16 of them in a second, but all of them, the way that he is working are meaningful and adding to the storytelling. I think one of my favorite ones was like pointing off like sort of off at the stage. It's like, you know, Babe Ruth before I'm going to hit that home run right there. Thank you very much. So there's like Americana from the future in the visual storytelling of this story that's about the past, but is also supposed to be about now at the same time. And it's exhausting to watch and just like, wow, wonderful.
Yeah.
Especially the choreography in Helpless and Satisfied, because you couldn't just choreograph Helpless and then do it backwards and for Satisfied, like from a different point of view, because Satisfied is the one where we rewind and we see all of those moments again from Angelica's point of view. And all of the choreography matches, but at a different tempo because it's in a different song. And so you can't, like, you're choreographing those two pieces, you have to choreograph them at one time. Otherwise they can't link up the correct way. So it's so intricate. Pretty neat. There's some videos also on YouTube where you can watch each of them, like the timing wise, where you can watch, okay, this is this moment in Helpless, this is the moment in Satisfied, and see how close they are. They really are exactly the same. For the ensemble, not for obviously Angelica and Eliza, because they're seeing everything differently. And sometimes it's from a different angle, like some of the other characters we're seeing them in different places as we would, which is kind of neat. As a director, I just look at that and I'm amazed, but also that would be the worst thing to have to figure out. A big challenge there.
So is that the choreographer that does most of that work, or is it them working together? Or, I mean,
it would be a lot of working together. The choreographer would bring the ideas for what those movements and pictures might look like, but the director would also be involved in saying, well, no, I want this person looking here, or I need them to hit this mark because this is where our light is,
right.
Whatever that might be.
Yeah. And was that circular stage designed for this show, or was that already part of the theater?
Yeah.
No, that was absolutely designed for, it's an overlay that sits on top of the stage. And the off-Broadway version, the center circle dropped down for the finale, and there was like a pool of water that Eliza looks into at the end, but that was a little bit cumbersome and complicated. So most Broadway shows have their own floor that they lay down over the stage floor. And so when, like, you go to see a traveling Broadway show, they've brought their floor as well to step down the stage, whether it's tracks for set pieces or to have a specific type of floor that your dancers are used to dancing on. Broadway theater stages are also raked at an angle and an incline. So you want to have that be the same for your performers every single night, depending on where they go.
Right.
So
do they have a person
and then bring it over to wherever they're using it?
Do they have a person that a crew member that's running the stage, and that's their whole job is rotating it at the right speed and the right direction at the right time?
I once was a stage manager in a show where my job was to rotate the different pieces of the set by hand myself. But thankfully on Broadway, it's all automated. But it is the job of a person the stage manager stands off stage on a headset with all of the sound, lighting, and set people, and they call every single cue in the show. So every lighting cue, every set cue to time to the music. And that's their whole job. The most complicated number in the show for them to do is the 10 dual commandments. It has the most cues like in one number of any of the other songs in the show.
Yeah. And what I loved about the video is the photography is incredible. The way they catch every little essential movement, and sometimes the choreography in the background. I mean, that would take a lot of work and planning as well.
Yeah, so they recorded 2 nights of live performances. So it's a convolute. Any of the wider shots are from live performance evenings. And then in between 2 of the shows, like on an afternoon, they shot only a few scenes and particular numbers in those close-ups. So if you're really seeing someone's face, that was done without the audience in the theater because the camera would get in the way of
I see.
the shot. But the person who edited and directed the video was also the director of the show. So he knew what he wanted and what he needed.
Right. Interesting.
But it's the most well done capture of a Broadway musical I've ever seen.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I normally don't like watching stage shows because usually it's not well done. I prefer the film version. In this case, it was incredible.
Yeah. And we don't get a lot of them. There's this taboo that if you film a Broadway show, no one will then go and see it and you won't be able to make any more money off of it. So you wouldn't get, the ones I remember watching when I was younger were Into the Woods and Cats. And they were both at least 15 years old, 20 years old by the time that anybody ever saw them. And it didn't excite anybody to go out and buy a theater ticket, I'd say.
Huh.
But now people watch Hamilton and they want to go see Hamilton.
Yeah, that's the way I feel. I'd love to see it now.
Yeah, you should. I'm coming through Boston again sometime soon. So
Yeah.
for that.
What can you tell me more about Lin Miranda? He was a whole new personality for me. I mean, then I know he wrote this other musical you mentioned. What's his background? What else has he written? What has he done since Hamilton? I know that he's been doing some Disney Plus things. What do you know about him?
Did you have a question, Nancy, before I go into?
I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, Volkert, maybe we could get a bus group together of people who want to see it live
There we go.
once the pandemic is over.
Yeah, that's that. We're all waiting for that.
Yeah, so let's plan that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, that was perfect. So Lin-Manuel Miranda grew up in New York in Washington Heights. His dad was an immigrant from Puerto Rico and worked for the mayor's office. I think he's in politics in New York. And Lin grew up in Washington Heights and loved musicals. His parents loved musicals, and he started writing the musical called In the Heights when he was at Wesleyan. And that's also where he met Tommy Kail, the director of Hamilton. So Tommy Kail was starting his own theater company, and he remembered this piece that Lin had written back at Wesleyan. And he said, do you want to keep working on that piece? And so they worked on it together with Alex Lacamoire and another music director, and with Andy Blankenbuehler. The same 4 people who put together Hamilton worked on In the Heights and brought it to Broadway, and it won Best New Musical, and everybody thought it was not going to do well. And so that kind of started his journey. And then that same group worked on Hamilton. In the meantime, Lin worked on writing the Spanish lyrics for the revival of West Side Story, because the 2 times ago when West Side Story was on Broadway, he wrote, they wanted to incorporate more Spanish lyrics for the characters. And so he wrote those with Stephen Sondheim.
Wow.
He worked on the Bring It On musical based on the movie from the 90s, Bring It On. And then Hamilton became really popular. But before Hamilton became popular, he had already started to work on Moana with Disney. And then Moana did well. And
Mhm.
so Encanto just came out, and that's like my kids cannot watch enough Encanto every day. It's like, can we watch Encanto? And we listen to the songs in the car all the time. And I would say what I think is really interesting about his film work versus his stage work is on stage, you have a lot, you want to take more time to get your ideas across, to build, to work into character development or plot development. In a movie, you need to get there pretty quickly, especially in kids' movies.
Mhm.
So his songs for Disney shows are much tighter and cleaner, you know, like little gift packages. Oh, he was also in Mary Poppins Returns. He played the lamplighter character, and
Oh.
he was a voice in Vivo, I think, which was on Netflix. And he plays a part in his Dark Materials on HBO, based on the Philip Pullman novels. So he's kind of doing a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But Encanto right now is the big one, because if he wins, if he were to win the Oscar for the song that was nominated from Encanto, he would get his EGOT, which is the Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony. So he just needs an Oscar.
Huh.
He's been nominated for before, but did not win. So
Yeah, I did watch Encanto after seeing Hamilton because I saw the name and I loved it, but it was too hyperactive for me. I mean, and I'm a hyperactive guy, but I've slowed down in my age, and it was way fast moving and just boom, 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 boom. There was not a slow moment in the whole show, but I think I want to see it again.
My children like it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then maybe I need to see Moana as well, which I haven't seen that yet.
Oh, Moana is beautiful.
Yeah.
It's really well done. I think the music for Encanto is even better than Moana, but I think that both of them tell really interesting stories and bring representation to kids' movies in a way that is important.
Well, what got my attention about Encanto is there was a story on NPR about how he went to, what country is it that it's from? Colombia. He went to Colombia to listen to the local music and get ideas from that music and then bring it back to the movie. And so it's as authentic as Disney can be. So I was very impressed with that. I saw David, you had your hand up there a second ago. And Mary.
Yeah, I was going to ask, he's really a talented person. Are there many other, most of the time, at least in the musicals that I knew when I was growing up, you have a lyricist and a songwriter, two different people working on a project like this. Here you've got a lyricist, songwriter, actor, I mean, the whole package. How many other people are out there doing that kind of thing with this level of success?
None. I mean, a lot of modern musicals are written by pairs of people. Like they might both work on music and lyrics together, but usually it's, divided. I'm having a hard time thinking of someone else who writes a show that when he wrote In the Heights, he said, I wrote In the Heights because I wanted a part in musicals for people like me who weren't like gangbangers and drug dealers, because that was all that I could get when I was trying to go audition for things. He's like, and West Side Story is the only other one, and I'm still in a gang, right? So the character of Usnavi is like this guy who just wants to help everyone and works hard and has a good heart. And so when you're writing shows for yourself, you want to be in them. When he was writing Hamilton, he didn't know whether he wanted to play Hamilton or Burr.
Oh, really?
Because the first song in the show was written to be a monologue by Burr. And it was the first song that he wrote. But then he slowly realized that the songs he was writing for Burr, he could not sing as well as they needed to be sung, and that they might be better served by somebody else. But even the most famous musical theater composers not just composers, but like Stephen Sondheim is not, starring in Sweeney Todd It's just very, very rare, as you say.
Mary, got to unmute.
Hi. Can you give background about what his mother did and also about his wife and family? And where did he go to college? You mentioned Westland, but where is that?
I think Wesleyan is in New York, but I would have to look.
Connecticut.
Connecticut, there you go.
Close enough.
I'm from Missouri, if you didn't know. Missouri.
Missouri.
So I still don't know where I am. His mom, I don't remember. You probably obviously know mom.
She's a clinical psychologist.
Got it. His wife is like a biophysicist engineer, like she's a scientist and a lawyer.
Wow.
And she doesn't really like musicals. So she's like his barometer. If she says that a song is like stuck in her head, he's like, all right, I probably got it. She doesn't otherwise. So he's surrounded by and his sister's very accomplished as well. So they're all very strong people.
Let's see. Let's go with Nancy.
I just want to say, I do think he's a genius, because I can't imagine anyone who isn't a genius writing that and doing all the other things he does. But he's so young. I don't know exactly how old he is, but must be around 40 or younger. And he's got decades ahead of him. So who knows what else he'll come up with. And he's amazing. So I hope he gets the
EGOT.
Okay. I hope he gets that.
Yeah.
He deserves it.
He is 42.
Oh, just a kid.
From our perspective, yeah.
He did win the MacArthur Genius Grant or whatever at some point. So I agree.
Yeah, good.
So you said earlier he works with a music arranger, composer. I mean, who's that other person that does the music with him, and what is their role?
So Alex Lacamoire is the one who arranges the music, which can mean different things for different composers, but basically Alex will transcribe what Lynn has written. Like he'll sing into a recorder, or he'll write like on the computer. And Alex will take it and say, well, this should be played by the trumpet, and this should be played by this instrument. You know what, we actually need to add a harmony here. And what do you think about, so even though Lynn is the writer, he would very quickly give credit to Alex Lacamoire, who did In the Heights and Hamilton with him, as well as Tom Hale and Andy Blankenbuehler. Like, even though they all have roles that are defined, when you're telling a story, sometimes those roles can get very blurry because you're all just trying to help each other tell the best story possible.
Right.
But one of my favorite examples is The Room Where It Happens, where Burr is upset that he's not part of making decisions, and that's sort of what throws him over the edge to like go run for office and make everyone mad. The song was supposed to kind of have like a Kander and Ebb feel, and Alex Lacamoire was like, how do I really get this song to sell? He's like, how about I take the guitar player and have him play this on banjo instead? And that was his decision, not Lynn's decision, like how to make that happen. A small example.
Yeah. Mary.
You talk about some of the women who were in the show, the two who played Eliza and what was her sister? Angelica.
Well, I know that you watched Angelica on soap operas when I was younger. Renee Elise Goldsberry, she also won a Tony Award for the role. Philippa Sue had just graduated from whatever conservatory program she was in, and she was off Broadway in a show called Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, which is a musical based on the first couple chapters of War and Peace. And they saw her in that and they were like, we need her in this show. So Hamilton was actually like her Broadway debut. And then the woman who plays Mariah Reynolds and Peggy Schuyler, Jasmine Cephas Jones, her dad is Ron Cephas Jones, musician and actor and really talented guy, but she was actually more like a jazz R&B singer and had done theater to sort of pay the bills, and said this was the first audition where she could sing like herself instead of having to sing to fit someone else's style. And the three of them together actually influenced how some of the songs are in their final form, because they would all sit around together and harmonize just for fun, and they post it online and do TikToks or whatever the kids do. But the music arranger, Alex Latimore, would hear them, and Lynn would hear them harmonizing, and they're like, they're sort of like the Destiny's Child of this show, or they're sort of like this mega girl group. We should have them sing a lot more complicated harmonies. And so that very ending riff in the Schuyler Sisters wasn't written originally. It was inspired by the people who were in the roles.
Wow.
Which brings me to like a, not Hamilton point, but a musical theater point. The just crazy success of Hamilton brought to the forefront the fact that people who were originating roles in Broadway musicals were getting no credit or compensation unless they had written the show. And all of these people who had basically created these characters, it was like, I get my paycheck and then I leave, and it's not a lot of money for something that becomes kind of like this cultural touchstone. And so many things that they could point to that they're like, he wrote that line because I say that, well, when John Lauren says, that's what I'm talking about at the beginning of Satisfied, that's like something that Anthony Ramos would say. And so then Lynn writes it into the script.
Oh.
And they weren't being compensated for any of those things. So the actors together, basically, they weren't quite going to strike, but they were bringing legal action if they didn't get new contracts written. And so now there's a new kind of contract that's written if you are originating a show on Broadway, where you can get like a part of 1% if, in perpetuity, which isn't going to make much difference for most Broadway shows, because most Broadway shows don't make money. But for these people to be recognized for their work, kind of like the people whose stories created a chorus line, those were their real life stories, and they never saw a cent off of a chorus line in whatever form that it's been in. So it reminded people that, especially after that, we're in a pandemic and everyone's saying like, oh, funding for the arts, why, we can't afford theater, we can't afford music, we can't afford band. It's like, well, what were you all doing while you were sitting at home for 2 years? Well, you were watching Netflix. Oh, you were reading,
books.
you were online enjoying creative arts that people are doing.
Yeah.
It's really crucial, and we don't want to lose sight of that either.
Good point. Yeah, thank you. I love that whole idea of compensating those people, because I think that, when I think about how intricate and all the little things that are going on in the show, and it obviously comes from all those people contributing little bits and pieces all over the place to make it that much more interesting. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, it had gotten to be kind of funky. Like there were all of these different types of contracts that would be written basically to try and make sure that a show could make it to Broadway. But that meant that the person who was losing out on money was the actor, not really anybody else.
Right.
So
is going back to In the Heights, is that available to see online anywhere?
So there's not a recording of the original staged version, but it was a movie musical this last summer.
Uh-huh.
So I think that's on HBO Max potentially. I thought it was a lovely, it's like a traditional musical to movie adaptation. and it's one of the better ones I've seen. It doesn't hold to the exact same structure, because a movie and a show structure are different. You have to change some things. I saw it like 3 times because I liked it so much. So
Yeah.
thought it was well done.
Or let's see, Mary, I see your hand. Unmute
Just a-
yourself. Yeah.
Now I forgot what I was going to ask. What did he, I know there was a, I don't know if it was public television or something. When he came out with Hamilton, he did some kind of special. What did he base his Hamilton thing on? Was it books? Was it history, previous productions or things that had been written about, Burr and Hamilton and other people?
He read the Ron Chernow biography, and that's where he sort of got the idea.
Mhm.
Because he kept seeing these ideas that were similar to today. So I think if you're just saying, oh, I'm going to take a story from forever ago and I'm going to make it clever by using, rap and hip hop and R&B music, it doesn't work unless there's actual connections to what people are experiencing today. And I think a testament to the vision of that is that if you watch that first performance of the first song that he did in 2009 at the White House, when he had written nothing else, almost all of it is the same. Every single thing that he says about what story he wanted to tell when he's introducing the song is the story that he told. And no matter what the historical inspiration is, he knew what message he wanted to send, and he's using Alexander Hamilton kind of as, just a fill-in for telling that story. But he was also felt really passionate about people today being connected to where we've come from and knowing about where we've come from, the good and the bad, but seeing that it really does have something to do with the lives that we're living today. And so he did other historical research, like I think you probably saw on PBS, there's this thing called Hamilton, the American Musical, which PBS doesn't put their great American musical pieces online. And I really dislike that, because they also did one on In the Heights, Chasing Broadway Dreams. But unless you do a membership drive and pay a lot of money, you don't get copies of those. But sat in, one of Hamilton's homes to write some numbers, or, he went to Weehawken and wrote a number here or there. But so there's inspiration, but if your goal is to tell a story from the past, that's only interesting to so many people if you can't make a connection to something else that they feel passionate about.
What were some of the correlations of things going on at the present time with Hamilton's time?
I think at first Lynn made a lot of connections to the idea of himself, like Hamilton, wherein he felt this great urgency and need to create, and what do you leave behind, and what are you doing for the future, and how do you care for other people? But then as he was reading into it, there's all these things about our government, like, do we take care of, these, are all of the colonies going to be separate, or, the financial system brought them all together? What are we going to allow? He had a real problem with not addressing directly the issue of slavery. He's got some references to it, but he's like, because there's even a third cabinet battle that he wrote about the issue of slavery. He was like, but it's just a cabinet battle where nobody decides to do anything at the end. So that's not very interesting dramatically. It doesn't take us anywhere. The gentleman who plays George Washington, Christopher Jackson, had a real struggle trying to reconcile how he as a Black man could portray this president who had slaves and never, they talk about Lawrence and his fight for abolition, but there's a lot of dichotomy, and there's a lot of dichotomy today in what we say we believe in, or what we do, or what we value, and what we're able to follow through with. I think the idea that none of our leaders are perfect, none of us are perfect, and what are our intentions and where do we fall short is something that resonates for sure.
Yeah. Well, anybody have any last questions? I want to start to wrap this up here, but any last questions? Nancy?
Very quickly, do you think we'll ever see it performed at Peterborough Players? Probably not. They don't have that rotating stage.
Yeah, not like a Broadway production. A few years ago, I would have said like, I can see all sorts of amateur productions of Hamilton happening. But now we're in a place where there are a bunch of shows that have characters that are ethnically ambiguous, shall I say. Like they're written on Broadway with certain ethnic groups in mind. And then when you do them in a community theater setting, the composer's like, you can use any groups of people. It can be any kind of like conflict, because not all places are able to present a diverse group of people. But a lot of those shows are currently being revised because that's no longer kind of the approach. And so I feel like there's something that's really crucial about the fact, like, yes, a bunch of white kids could play all of the parts in Hamilton, but are we telling the same story? Does the story have the same meaning if that's what we're doing? I don't know. It's something I think people will have to grapple with when the rights are available, which will probably not be for a long time.
Right.
Yeah, the fact you have people of color playing those white characters of American history tells a story in and of itself, and it really makes you think about it and how you could extract that and make it different. Would, like you say, it changes the whole story. Yeah. Anybody else have any other questions, comments? Any last thoughts from you, Liz, before we kind of wrap this up?
One of my favorite little nugget statistics is that Hamilton's average word per minute in the show is 144 words per minute. The musical that most people would relate to, they'd be like, oh, it's sort of like Gilbert and Sullivan. Well, Pirates of Penzance average words per minute is 53.
Oh,
If you were to perform Hamilton at the same pace as other Broadway shows, it would take 6 hours. And for that reason, if you're in the orchestra for Hamilton, there's a click track. So like every time the tempo is to change, it's set to a predetermined track. So you have like a predetermined click so that the show is the same length no matter what day you see it.
Really?
Because it's so long and the tempos are so intricate that will always be exactly the same. I mentioned earlier the Guns and Ships rap is like, that's like, if you can rap Guns and Ships, you've made it. There are 19 words in 3 seconds. So 6.3 words per second.
Yeah.
And there are 20,520 total words in the cast album of Hamilton. So
Wow.
Hopefully if you want to memorize all of that. That's why I feel like it's very Shakespeare-esque. You've got some wordy things happening there. Words.
Well, it's nice to hear you say that, because I was kind of overwhelmed the first time I heard it. I mean, I loved it, but I was overwhelmed. But now that I've listened to it, I've seen it 3 times. I've listened to the soundtrack twice. The words are starting to find a place in my brain. And it's one of those shows that I want to go back and listen to again and again. So this conversation is a perfect way to give me more things to think about and just, approach it in a whole new light with all the things you've shared with us tonight. So I want to thank you, and let's all give Liz a big hand. Thank you for joining us, and I hope we can do this again, maybe with some other, yes, we just have some thank yous in the comments there. Thank you, and thanks all for joining us. And this is recorded, so we'll share it with our community in our newsletter this weekend.
It
Thank
helps to watch it with closed captions turned on.
Yeah, it's true. I will try that one of these times. Yeah, thank you.
oh.
I'll tell
Okay,
you my last piece of advice, Volkert, is when you're listening to the cast album has made some, as a musician, you might appreciate some changes in the levels of instrumentation and in timing. So compared to watching the live version, the cast album is meant to feel more like an album that a kid would buy, like a hip hop album. So see if you can pick up any of the subtle differences that they have between the recording and the cast album.
I will do that. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll see you again sometime. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.